Speed up the inheritance, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral. I've already started looking at houses. I was standing only a few feet behind her when she said it. She didn't know I could hear every word. The church smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of quiet, respectful place where people lower their voices and speak gently about the dead. My husband, Richard, had been laid to rest just minutes earlier. 52 years of marriage, lowered slowly into the ground beneath a gray Ohio sky. And while the pastor was still speaking with the last of the mourners, Vanessa was already planning what to buy with his money. I stood still beside the last row of chairs, my gloved hands folded together, listening to her continue in that soft, hurried tone people use when they think no one important is nearby. Daniel says his mom won't understand the finances anyway, she said. If we push the paperwork through quickly, we could close before summer. A man beside her, one of Daniel's friends from work, murmured something I couldn't quite catch. Vanessa gave a small laugh, light and impatient. Look, Richard had plenty saved. That house alone is worth close to $900,000. Once the inheritance clears, we're done living in that cramped place. My eyes moved slowly across the room to my son. Daniel stood near the stained glass windows, speaking politely with two distant relatives, his expression calm and composed. He looked like a grieving son, but now I wondered how much he already knew. The pastor's voice echoed softly through the hall as more guests began drifting toward the doors. A few people stopped to hug Vanessa, telling her how strong she had been through everything. She nodded graciously, pressing tissues to the corners of her eyes. Anyone watching would believe she was heartbroken. I watched her carefully. Not once did she look toward the casket. Instead, she glanced down at her phone, scrolling quickly as though checking something urgent. Perhaps a real estate listing. Perhaps mortgage rates. Perhaps a message from Daniel. For a long moment I said nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't confront her. Instead I simply turned and walked toward the exit where the cold afternoon air slipped through the open doors. Outside, the cemetery stretched across gentle hills of green grass and white stone markers. The wind tugged lightly at my coat as I looked down at the fresh earth covering Richard's grave. My husband had always been careful with money. Methodical, quietly protective. In the last year of his life, he handled every document himself, every bank visit, every phone call with the accountant. I had trusted him completely, the way you trust someone after half a century of shared mornings, shared dinners, shared worries about children and mortgages and retirement. Now, standing beside the grave, I remembered something he had said only weeks before he passed. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with a folder open in front of him, tapping a pen against the paper. "Margaret," he told me, looking unusually serious, "if anything ever feels strange after I'm gone, promise me you'll talk to Thomas Blake." Thomas Blake, our attorney of nearly 30 years. At the time I had brushed the comment aside, assuming it was just another precaution from a man who liked things organized. But hearing Vanessa today changed everything. As the wind rustled through the tall oak trees around the cemetery, I looked back toward the church doors where my son and his wife were now stepping outside together. Daniel placed a hand on Vanessa's shoulder, guiding her gently down the path. They looked like a united couple facing the future. I watched them quietly, remembering every word she had whispered only minutes earlier. Then I reached into my purse, took out my phone, and searched for the number of Thomas Blake. I drove home from the cemetery slowly, the late afternoon sun hanging low over the quiet streets of Columbus, Ohio, casting long shadows across the pavement. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning when Richard and I had left together for the hospital 3 weeks earlier, except now only one of us had come back. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and lemon polish that still lingered in the kitchen. The silence felt heavier than I expected. For more than 50 years this house had always carried the small sounds of two people moving through it together. Richard reading the newspaper at the dining table, the low hum of the television in the evening, the steady rhythm of his footsteps down the hallway. Now there was nothing. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Vanessa's words from the church replayed in my mind with perfect clarity. Speed up the inheritance. I have already started looking at houses. I had spent most of my life believing that grief revealed the best parts of people, that when someone died, families pulled closer together. Today I learned something very different. I moved slowly through the living room, my fingers brushing the back of Richard's favorite leather chair. His reading glasses still rested on the small side table beside it, exactly where he had left them. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember the way he used to sit there every evening, carefully folding the newspaper after finishing the crossword puzzle. Richard had always been patient, quiet, observant. He rarely spoke about other people's motives, but when he did, he was almost always right. The memory of our conversation at the kitchen table returned to me with surprising sharpness. The folder in front of him, the careful way he tapped his pen against the page. "Margaret, if anything ever feels strange after I am gone, promise me you will talk to Thomas Blake." At the time I laughed softly and told him he worried too much. Now the sentence echoed differently in my mind. I walked toward the hallway where the small desk sat beneath the window. Richard kept most of our paperwork there in neatly labeled folders. Insurance, taxes, property records. His handwriting was precise, almost old-fashioned, every label printed clearly in black ink. I opened the drawer and looked through the rows of documents until I found the thin leather address book he had used for years. The pages were worn along the edges from being handled so often. When I reached the letter B, I saw the name immediately. Blake, Thomas, attorney at law. The phone number was written carefully beside it. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the number as the late afternoon light filtered through the window behind me. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary neighborhood. Inside the house, however, something had shifted quietly beneath the surface. I picked up the phone and dialed the number, listening to each ring with a calm that surprised even me. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered. Thomas Blake had been Richard's attorney for nearly 3 decades, a steady and practical man who spoke carefully and listened even more carefully. When he heard my voice, his tone softened immediately. "Margaret, I am very sorry for your loss. Richard was a good friend." I thanked him politely and took a slow breath before continuing. "Thomas," I said, "there is something I think Richard wanted me to ask you about." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a response that made my grip tighten slightly around the phone. "Yes, Margaret," he said quietly. I believe he did. Thomas Blake did not sound surprised to hear from me. His voice remained calm and steady on the other end of the line, the same measured tone he had used for years whenever Richard discussed contracts, taxes, or property records. "Margaret," he said carefully, "Richard asked me to expect your call one day." I did not respond right away. I stood by the desk, the phone pressed gently against my ear while the quiet house listened with me. "Expect my call," I repeated softly. "Yes," he replied. About 6 months ago, Richard made several changes to the way his assets were organized. At the time, he told me that if anything ever felt unusual after he passed away, I should make sure you understood exactly what he had done. I felt the slightest shift inside my chest, not fear and not relief, but something closer to curiosity. Richard had always been a thoughtful man. If he prepared something, there was always a reason. Thomas continued speaking in the calm, precise way attorneys often do when they choose each word carefully. "Margaret, I believe it would be best if we discuss the details in person. Would you be able to come to my office tomorrow morning?" I looked out the small window above the desk. The sky had grown darker, and the streetlights along our block had already begun to glow softly against the evening air. Tomorrow morning would be less than 24 hours after Richard's funeral. Under ordinary circumstances, that would have felt too soon. But nothing about today felt ordinary anymore. "Yes," I said quietly. "I can come tomorrow." 10 o'clock would work well, Thomas replied. "There are several documents that Richard wanted you to see personally." When the call ended, I remained standing there for a moment, still holding the phone in my hand. The house had grown even quieter as the evening settled in around it. In the kitchen, the clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking each second with patient certainty. Richard had always liked simple clocks. Nothing digital, nothing flashy. Just a clean white face and black hands that moved slowly through the hours. I walked back toward the living room where the last traces of daylight rested against the hardwood floors. Richard's chair sat exactly where it had always been, angled slightly toward the window so he could watch the neighborhood while he read. I lowered myself into the seat across from it and folded my hands in my lap. Vanessa's voice returned again in my memory. "Speed up the inheritance. I have already started looking at houses." The sentence no longer sounded shocking. Instead, it sounded impatient. calculating, as though the future she imagined was already guaranteed. I wondered how many conversations she and Daniel had already had about money during the past few months. I wondered how long Richard had been aware of it. My husband had never been a suspicious man, but he had always been observant. If he noticed something troubling, he would not react emotionally. He would prepare quietly. I looked again toward the hallway desk where the address book still lay open beneath the lamp. Richard's handwriting had always been neat and careful, the kind that came from growing up in a time when people still practiced penmanship in school. Blake Thomas, attorney at law. As I watched the steady rhythm of the clock on the wall, one thought became clearer with every passing minute. Whatever Richard had arranged, he had done it deliberately. And tomorrow morning I was going to find out why. The next morning arrived quietly, the way most mornings do in a neighborhood that has not yet realized someone's life has changed forever. I woke before sunrise, long before the alarm clock had a chance to ring. For years Richard had been the first one awake in this house, moving softly through the kitchen while the coffee maker hummed to life. That morning the kitchen was silent. I dressed slowly, choosing the same dark coat I had worn the day before. The air outside carried the cool sharpness of early spring as I stepped into the driveway and started the car. Columbus was just beginning to wake up. A few delivery trucks rolled through the streets and the traffic lights blinked patiently above empty intersections. Richard and I had driven these roads together thousands of times over the decades. First when we were young and saving every dollar we could, later when the company began to grow and our lives became more comfortable. I followed the familiar route downtown toward Thomas Blake's office building, a tall brick structure that had stood on the same corner for more than 40 years. Richard trusted things that lasted. Buildings like this. People like Thomas Blake. I parked along the curb and sat in the car for a moment, watching the city move around me. Office workers crossed the sidewalks with travel mugs in their hands. A bus stopped at the corner and released a small crowd of commuters who hurried toward nearby buildings. Life continued forward with quiet determination. I stepped inside the lobby and took the elevator to the fourth floor where Thomas had worked for most of his career. The hallway smelled faintly of paper and furniture polish, the same scent I remembered from years earlier when Richard and I signed documents for the company's first expansion. Thomas Blake was already waiting when I arrived. He stood as I entered his office and greeted me with the kind of respectful warmth that only comes from long friendships. "Margaret," he said gently, "I am glad you came." I thanked him and took the chair across from his desk while he closed the door behind us. His office looked exactly the same as it always had. Tall shelves filled with legal books lined the walls, and a large oak desk sat beneath the window where sunlight spilled across neat stacks of folders. Thomas opened one of those folders carefully and rested his hands on the papers inside. "Your husband asked me to prepare several legal arrangements over the past year," he began. "He did not tell me everything he suspected, but he did say he wanted to make certain that you would never be placed in a vulnerable position." I listened quietly, remembering how deliberate Richard had been during the last months of his life. He had made extra visits to the bank. He had spoken with Thomas several times on the phone behind closed doors. At the time I assumed he was organizing routine matters. Now those quiet preparations began to take on a different meaning. Thomas slid the folder across the desk toward me and turned it so that I could read the first page. The document carried Richard's signature at the bottom along with several official stamps from the county. "Margaret," he said calmly, "your husband created a family trust earlier this year. According to this document, you are not simply the beneficiary. You are the controlling trustee of every major asset he owned." For a moment I said nothing. The words settled slowly into place in my mind while the morning light from the window warmed the desk between us. Thomas continued speaking in the same measured voice. "The house, the investment accounts, and the company shares are all protected inside the trust structure. No transfer, sale, or inheritance can move forward without your direct authorization." Outside the office window, the city continued moving through another ordinary morning. Inside the quiet room, I began to understand something very simple. Richard had not been preparing for his death. He had been preparing for what might happen after it. The document remained on the desk between us while the meaning of Thomas Blake's words slowly settled into place. Controlling trustee. The phrase carried a quiet weight that was impossible to misunderstand. For more than 5 decades, Richard had handled every major financial decision in our household, not because I could not, but because that was simply how our marriage had naturally arranged itself over time. Now, according to the document in front of me, he had carefully placed that responsibility in my hands. Thomas folded his glasses and rested them beside the folder before speaking again. Richard was very specific when we prepared this trust, he said. He wanted to ensure that no one could pressure you into making quick decisions about the estate. The structure prevents immediate transfers, property sales, or asset withdrawals unless you approve them personally. I read the first page again slowly. Richard's signature appeared strong and steady, exactly the way it had looked on every contract he had signed during the years he built his company from a small office above a hardware store into a successful regional business. My husband had always believed in patience. Build carefully. Protect what you build. Do not rush important decisions. Thomas opened another section of the folder and turned it toward me. The trust includes the house on Maple Ridge Drive, the investment portfolio, and the company shares. Combined value is estimated at a little over $3.8 million based on current market conditions. The number did not surprise me. Richard had been transparent about the company's growth over the years. What surprised me was something else. According to this structure, Thomas continued, Daniel does not automatically inherit anything right now. The assets remain protected inside the trust under your management. A quiet understanding passed through my mind as I looked at the documents. Vanessa's voice echoed again from the church hallway the day before. Speed up the inheritance. I have already started looking at houses. She had sounded confident, almost certain, as if the money had already arrived. Thomas slid another page forward, this one carrying several additional conditions written in Richard's familiar language. Your husband also included instructions regarding future distributions, he explained. If you decide to release portions of the estate to Daniel, it must be done gradually and under your supervision. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked toward the tall window behind Thomas's desk, where the morning traffic moved steadily through downtown Columbus. Richard had known something. Maybe not everything, but enough to make him cautious. Thomas watched my expression carefully before speaking again. Margaret, there is one more thing you should understand. The trust also prevents anyone from removing you from the property or making housing decisions on your behalf. The house legally remains under your authority. No one can sell it, transfer it, or relocate you without your written consent. I felt a quiet stillness settle inside my thoughts as that final sentence reached its full meaning. Yesterday, someone had already begun planning where I might live once the inheritance moved forward. This morning, I was holding the legal structure that made those plans impossible without my approval. Thomas closed the folder gently and rested his hands on the desk. Richard did not explain every detail of his concerns, he said, but he wanted to make certain that you would always have control over your own future. I placed my hand lightly over the first page of the trust documents, tracing the familiar curve of my husband's signature. Richard had always been a careful man, and now it was becoming clear just how careful he had been. I left Thomas Blake's office carrying a thin leather folder that now held copies of the trust documents Richard had prepared. The morning sunlight outside felt brighter than it had earlier, reflecting off the tall glass buildings along the street as people hurried past on their way to work. For them, it was just another weekday morning in downtown Columbus. For me, it was the moment everything had quietly changed. Richard had not only protected our savings, he had protected my position in the family. I walked slowly toward my car, thinking about the calm certainty Vanessa had shown at the funeral the day before. She had spoken as though the future already belonged to her and Daniel, as though the money would move quickly from Richard's accounts into their plans. Now I understood that nothing could move without my decision. The drive home took nearly 20 minutes. Traffic had grown heavier as the city filled with commuters, but I did not rush. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, replaying Thomas's explanation in my mind. Controlling trustee. No transfers without your authorization. No sale of the house without your consent. Richard had built an invisible wall around everything he owned, and he had placed the key in my hands. When I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, the neighborhood looked exactly the way it always had. The same trimmed lawns, the same quiet sidewalks, the same maple trees that had grown tall during the decades Richard and I lived here together. I parked in the driveway and stepped inside the house where the afternoon light stretched softly across the living room floor. For a few minutes, I placed the folder on the kitchen table and simply stood there, letting the silence settle again. It was the same silence I had felt the day before, but now it carried a different meaning. Yesterday, I had been a widow who believed everything might soon be taken from her. Today I understood something very different. Around 2 o'clock the quiet of the house was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the front window, I saw Daniel's sedan come to a stop beside the curb. Vanessa stepped out first, her sunglasses resting on top of her hair, while she looked toward the house with the confident posture she always carried. Daniel followed a moment later, adjusting his jacket as they walked together up the path to the door. I opened it before they could knock. "Margaret," Daniel said with a polite smile that looked carefully practiced, "we thought we would stop by and check on you." Vanessa gave a soft, sympathetic expression that might have convinced someone who had not heard her conversation the day before. "We just want to make sure you are not feeling overwhelmed," she added gently. "Funerals can be exhausting." I nodded and stepped aside to let them enter the living room. Daniel sat on the sofa, while Vanessa remained standing near the window, looking around the house as though measuring the space with her eyes. After a brief moment, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, "there are a few practical things we should probably start discussing soon. Paperwork. Accounts. The estate process can take a long time if we do not organize everything early." Vanessa glanced toward him before speaking again in that same calm voice. "We just want to help make things easier for you, Margaret. Sometimes it is better when the younger generation handles complicated financial matters." I listened quietly while they spoke, my hands resting loosely together in my lap. Richard's leather folder sat on the kitchen table only a few steps away. For the first time since the funeral, I understood the full shape of the situation unfolding inside this house. Daniel and Vanessa believed they were beginning a conversation about inheritance. What they did not yet realize was that the conversation had already been decided long before Richard was buried. Daniel leaned forward slightly on the sofa, resting his elbows on his knees the way he used to when he was younger, and trying to explain something important. "Mom," he said carefully, "the estate process can get complicated if we wait too long. Dad had investments, the company shares, and the house. Vanessa and I were thinking it might be smart to start organizing everything early so there are no delays later." Vanessa nodded in agreement, folding her hands together in a polite gesture that looked almost rehearsed. "We only want to help you, Margaret," she said softly. "This kind of paperwork can be overwhelming after such a loss. Sometimes it is easier when someone else handles the details." I listened quietly while they spoke, noticing how naturally the conversation had shifted from sympathy to strategy. Daniel's voice carried a tone of gentle urgency, the kind people use when they believe a decision should be made quickly. Vanessa's eyes moved slowly around the living room again, pausing briefly on the staircase, then the hallway that led toward the kitchen. I wondered if she was imagining how the house might look once it belonged to them. Daniel continued speaking, choosing his words carefully. "We were also thinking about the house," he added. "It might be a lot for you to manage on your own now. The yard, the maintenance, the property taxes. Maybe we could look into selling it at the right time and finding you something smaller." Vanessa stepped closer to the window, her voice gentle but confident. "There are some very nice retirement communities nearby, quiet places with good neighbors and maintenance included. You would not have to worry about anything." For a moment I said nothing. The room felt still, filled with the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall that Richard had installed more than 15 years earlier. Daniel and Vanessa both watched me, waiting for a response that they seemed certain would eventually come. I could see the patience in their expressions, but also the expectation. They believed this conversation would naturally lead to their involvement in every financial decision that followed. My eyes moved briefly toward the kitchen table, where Richard's leather folder remained exactly where I had left it earlier that afternoon. Inside that folder rested the documents that quietly changed everything they were discussing. Daniel noticed my glance toward the kitchen and followed it with his eyes. He smiled slightly. "Dad kept most of his paperwork pretty organized," he said. "We can go through it together if you want. That will help us understand what steps we need to take next." Vanessa gave a small nod of agreement. "Exactly. The sooner we understand the accounts and inheritance structure, the easier everything will be for the family." The word inheritance hung in the air for a moment. I remembered again the sentence I had overheard at the funeral only a day earlier. "Speed up the inheritance." I have already started looking at houses. Now, sitting across from them in the quiet living room Richard had spent decades building into a home, I finally spoke. Richard was very careful with his Planning, I said calmly. He believed that important decisions should never be rushed. Daniel's smile tightened slightly, though he tried to keep his tone relaxed. Of course, Mom. We just want to make sure everything moves smoothly. I nodded once, my voice steady. I understand. What neither of them realized yet was that Richard had already decided exactly how smoothly anything would move at all. I watched Daniel and Vanessa carefully as the silence settled again in the living room. Neither of them spoke for several seconds, but I could see the quiet impatience beginning to appear in the way Vanessa shifted her weight slightly near the window. Daniel glanced toward the kitchen once more before looking back at me with the same polite smile he had been wearing since they arrived. Mom, he said gently, maybe we could start by looking at the bank accounts this week. Dad probably had everything organized, but sometimes there are forms that need to be filed quickly. Vanessa nodded in agreement. Exactly. Banks can freeze things if the paperwork takes too long. We just want to make sure nothing gets delayed. I folded my hands together calmly in my lap and looked at my son. Daniel had always been a careful man when it came to business. Growing up, he watched his father build the company piece by piece, learning the value of planning and discipline. But sitting here now, I noticed something different in the way he spoke. His tone carried an urgency that did not match the quiet pace Richard had always preferred when dealing with important matters. Vanessa stepped a little closer toward the center of the room and rested her hand lightly on the back of the armchair beside her. We also thought it might be a good idea to speak with the lawyer soon, she added. Estates can take months to process if everything is not handled right away. If we start early, the inheritance could move much faster. The word inheritance again floated softly through the room. I remembered clearly how confidently she had used that same word in the church hallway the day before. Daniel gave a small nod. Vanessa has already looked into a few things online, just to understand the process. I stood slowly from my chair and walked toward the kitchen table where the leather folder rested in the afternoon light. The sound of my footsteps across the hardwood floor made both of them turn slightly to follow my movement. I placed one hand on the folder and opened it carefully. Inside were the copies Thomas Blake had given me that morning. Several neatly prepared pages, each one carrying Richard's signature and the official language that protected everything he had built. Daniel leaned forward slightly from the sofa, curiosity rising in his expression. Is that the paperwork Dad left? He asked. I lifted the top document and held it gently between my fingers. Your father did speak with the lawyer, I said calmly. He made sure everything was very clear before he passed away. Vanessa stepped closer now, her attention fixed on the papers in my hand. That is good, she replied with a small reassuring smile. It means the inheritance process should be straightforward. I looked at her for a moment before speaking again. Richard created a family trust earlier this year. Daniel blinked slightly. A trust? Yes, I answered. A legal structure that protects the house, the company shares, and the investment accounts. Vanessa's expression did not change immediately, but I noticed the slight pause in her breathing. Daniel straightened a little on the sofa. So the trust handles the inheritance automatically? He asked. I shook my head gently and placed the document back into the folder. No, I said quietly. The trust does not move anything automatically. According to the documents your father signed, every decision about the estate must go through the controlling trustee. Daniel looked puzzled. And who is that? He asked. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. Richard made that decision very clear before he passed away. The trustee is me. Daniel did not respond immediately after I said the words. The trustee is me. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment as the meaning settled slowly into place. Vanessa's polite expression faded just slightly, not enough for someone unfamiliar with her to notice, but enough for me to see the change. Daniel leaned back against the sofa and looked at the folder in my hands with a new kind of focus. So you control the trust, he said carefully. Yes, I answered. Your father arranged it that way earlier this year. Vanessa crossed her arms loosely, her tone still gentle, but no longer quite as confident as before. That just means you approve the inheritance when the time comes, correct? The lawyer will handle the rest of the paperwork. I walked slowly back toward the armchair and sat down again, placing the folder on the table beside me. The trust does not work that way, I said calmly. Nothing moves automatically. Every decision about the house, the company shares, and the accounts must go through the trustee first. Daniel frowned slightly, thinking through what I had just said. You mean you decide when anything is distributed? Exactly, I replied. Richard wanted to make sure no one rushed anything after he was gone. Vanessa's eyes moved quickly toward Daniel before she spoke again. But eventually the inheritance still goes to the family, right? That was always the plan. I looked at her quietly. Richard's plan was to protect what he built and to make sure it was handled carefully. The trust allows distributions only when the trustee believes the timing is appropriate. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly, the way he used to when trying to understand a complicated business agreement. So there is no immediate transfer of the assets? Not unless I authorize it, I said. The clock on the wall ticked softly behind us. Vanessa glanced again toward the kitchen as if trying to calculate something quickly in her mind. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice more cautious than before. How long can the trust hold the estate? As long as necessary, I replied. Richard designed it to remain active for years if needed. The house stays protected. The company shares remain under the trust, and the accounts cannot be withdrawn without approval. Vanessa's confidence had disappeared completely now, replaced by a quiet stillness. For the first time since they arrived, she did not seem sure what to say next. Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back into the sofa. Dad really planned this carefully, he said. Yes, I answered softly. He did. I folded my hands together again and looked around the living room that Richard had spent decades building into a home. The same photographs still rested on the shelves. The same chair where he read every evening remained by the window. The house had not changed, but the balance inside it had. Daniel stood after a moment and walked slowly toward the front door, clearly thinking through everything he had just learned. Vanessa followed. A step behind him, her earlier confidence replaced by quiet uncertainty. Before leaving, Daniel turned back toward me. I guess we will talk more about this later, Mom, he said. Of course, I replied calmly. Important decisions should never be rushed. The front door closed softly behind them, and the house returned once again to its familiar silence. I sat there for several minutes listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Richard had known exactly what he was doing when he built that trust. He had not only protected his life's work, he had protected the one person he trusted to guard it after he was gone.